In this lecture video, I'm going to be giving the kind of basic argument, you could say, of the Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Right, this is kind of a almost an introduction to the idea of communism, but of course, ultimately from an anarchist or anarcho-communist perspective. Now, Kropotkin begins with an account of what he calls our riches, right? The kind of economic ability we possess that human beings, for 99.9% of human existence, could not do, thanks to the rise of capitalism and specifically industrialization. So he says, while the hunter of old had to scour 50 or 60 square miles to find food for his family, right, so a hunter-gatherer existence, the civilized man supports his household with far less pains and far more certainty on a thousandth of that space. Climate is no longer an obstacle. With the cooperation of those intelligent beings, modern machines, 100 men manufacture now the stuff to provide 10,000 persons with clothing for 2 years, right? So the kind of lengths human beings had to go to in the past, whether hunter-gatherer, early agrarian societies, etc., now it's far more easier to work to provide subsistence, right? What is needed to live, shelter, food, water. But not only that, not only is it actually less difficult to attain those things, we can actually attain more, right? Machines allow us to plant more crops, to grow, to distribute more crops, using less energy, or less, energy per person, we could say. He also says, millions of human beings have labored to create the civilization on which we pride ourselves today. Other millions, scattered throughout the globe, labor to maintain it. Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years but ruins. There is not even a thought or an invention which is not common property, born of the past and the present. Thousands of inventors, known and unknown, who have died in poverty, have cooperated in the invention of each of these machines which embody the genius of man. So all of us that live with, cars, and we go to our place of work, or we go to a grocery store and we eat the foods and we enjoy the movies and so on, right? All of these things, you have to imagine, right, not only who was the writer behind the movie you're watching, who came up with the idea to create the technology to make a movie, who had the idea of creating a camera in the first place, who not only had the idea, but who worked on it, not only who then worked on it as an inventor, but then who then employed the people to create the cameras in the first place, who then created the aspects of society that made it possible for someone to think about even creating something like a movie, right? All these different things, it requires the work of everyone, and all these people, right? We, so to speak, stand on the shoulders of giants, in the sense of that we kind of are thrown into the world. We are born into a world where all of this has kind of been established, and we continue that process of building on it, right? In a way, we're all indebted to each other, and we are indebted to the past, because it is through humanity itself working toward the future that it has created the ability to actually make life easier, to provide clothing cheaply, to provide shelter more cheaply, to provide a luxurious existence, right? Something that even the working class person today often, lives more luxuriously than did, let's say, a feudal lord, in the medieval era. Now, that doesn't excuse, of course, the injustices that continue today, as Kropotkin is going to argue, but the point is to show, right, the ways in which humanity has progressed to make life easier, right? That has conquered bread, made food something far much easier to obtain. Why, though, if society is so rich with this potential and this ability to create all this food and make life easier, why are the many poor? Why do so many still starve? Why do so many still live poor? Why do so many work so many hours still? Why do so many now today actually are heading into a lower standard of living than the previous generation? Kropotkin's answer is that, well, there's a tyranny of the means of production. That capitalism, although it has made this possible, it has made society rich, it favors a hierarchical, authoritarian structure of what we could call a private government of the means of production, right? Where either one person or a handful of people really control the capital necessary to create these resources and dictate to workers, right, what they have to do, how they have to live their lives in order to be given a means of subsistence. And all this is because profit is favored over well-being. As Kropotkin says, it is because all that is necessary for production, the land, the mines, the highways, machinery, food, shelter, education, knowledge, all have been seized by the few in the course of that long story of robbery and forced migration and wars, of ignorance and oppression, which has been the life of the human race before it had learned to subdue the forces of nature. That this is not something new, right? It's not that capitalism is uniquely unjust or uniquely exploitative. Now, it has its different ways of being exploitative. But this is something that has gone on throughout almost all of human history, or at least civilized human history, right? That what has happened is a majority of people have owned the wealth that have dictated to the majority of the people how to work and how much they get paid and what kind of life they're going to live, because of course those few people who are privileged have this kind of fetishization of luxury at the expense of the well-being of all. Now, what this has created for capitalism is a kind of socio-economic coercion, where there's this dilemma. You either work for a capitalist or starve. Now, where it was the case before in, let's say, the ancient epoch, the ancient era, you had the majority of production done by actually slave labor. So you had this dichotomy between the slave and the master. Now, in feudalism, the serf was no longer tied to a single individual, right, a master. They were tied to the land. And in capitalism, the worker is not tied to a single individual. They're not tied to the land. They can actually go find a different job, work in a different industry. They are tied, though, to a class, the capitalist class. They either must work for a capitalist or starve. Now, one might say, of course, well, what you can do is become a capitalist yourself, become an entrepreneur or a business person. Okay, how do you do that? Well, most of the time, 99% of the time, you have to, at some point, employ workers. You have to get workers to work for you, which means, basically, you either become a capitalist or you become a worker that works for the capitalist, or you starve. Now, someone might say, see, that means it's possible for workers to become capitalists, which is why it's not unjust. There's this kind of class mobility. But here's the problem. To be a capitalist, right, if I own a factory, I need workers. That means, and of course the workers are always going to outnumber the owner, that means it is not possible for everyone to become a capitalist. It is universally contradictory if everyone were to try and do that. The system would collapse, which means the system actually only exists because a majority of people must be workers. They can never be capitalists. They can never be, you can call it a business owner, an entrepreneur, whatever else. So I want to look at two quotes here that kind of exemplify this by Kropotkin. So first he says, in virtue of this monstrous system, the son of the worker, on entering life, finds no field which he may till, no machine which he may tend, no mine in which he may dig, without accepting without accepting to leave a great part of what he will produce to a master. He must sell his labor for a scant and uncertain wage. So what does he mean? Well, I think we can look at two things here in this quote. One, basically all property is already owned, right? There is no kind of like undiscovered property which someone can just come upon and use their labor to create value out of it, right? Almost everything is owned by someone, and most of it is owned by a small handful of individuals. Secondly, what does he mean that this worker will have to accept that by working for them, they leave a great part of what they will produce to the master? Well, what happens is, of course, if a worker produces, let's say, 100 water bottles, okay? And each water bottle is sold for, let's say, $10, okay? So that means they've created $1,000 of value here, right? Because they've been able to, the revenue, right, that comes is $1,000. Now, let's say the wage is $10 an hour, okay? And let's say the worker worked, just to make this easy, 10 hours, okay? So the worker works 10 hours for $10 an hour. They produced 100 water bottles that are sold for $10 each, which comes to $1,000 if I have my math right. In return, the worker gets $100. Now, that means the worker produced $1,000, but got in return $100. They only got 1/10 of the full value which they produced. Where does the rest go? Well, of course, to the capitalist, the owner. The owner gets to decide what to do with the rest of that, right? The profit. Now, let's say, well, you know, it took $100 to provide the supplies to make all the water bottles and everything, right? Okay, well, then you take that $100 to pay for the materials and the machines and everything needed for the supplies. Well, then the capitalist still gets $800, right? The worker $100, the capitalist, who provided $100 worth of material for someone to work on and turn into $1,000, gets $800. They get to decide what to do with that money. Now, maybe they say, you know what, I'm going to give you $200, worker. Well, okay, they give the worker $200. That's nice. That's like $20 an hour. Except, well, the capitalist still gets $700. The worker is still denied the full value of their labor. The next quote I want to look at by Kropotkin, he says, "We cry shame on the feudal baron who forbade the peasant to turn a clod of earth unless he surrendered to his lord a fourth of his crop," right? Because that was the case. The serf always had to give a certain proportion of their crop that they cultivated to the lord. But, Kropotkin says, if the forms have changed, the relations have remained the same, and the worker is forced under the name of the free contract to accept feudal obligations, right? In the case that I just provided of the worker being denied the full value of their labor. For, turn where he will, he can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept or die of hunger. Now, why does the technological power not produce well-being for all, right? Because we might want to say, okay, but there still seems to be the capacity that perhaps we could have capitalism where we have, of course, private ownership of the means of production, and yet we could use all this technological capacity to produce enough food and everything so no one ever goes hungry, no one is homeless, and so on. Why doesn't that happen, though? It's an empirical fact. It just doesn't happen. Well, there are many different reasons we can point to, but two reasons that have remained the same throughout the last 100 years since this book was written is, one, the owners of capital constantly reduce the output, right? They constantly produce the amount of food perhaps they produce by restraining production. Now, why would they do that? Why would they purposely limit production? And one example that Kropotkin gives is cartloads of oysters are thrown into the sea instead of sold on market. Why? Well, if you have too much supply, the price of it goes down, which means less profit. You can't make as much profit. So you need the supply to be tight. This is why we find food in the restaurant industry thrown out. Good food just thrown out because it is more profitable to throw away good food than to just give the leftovers to people that need it. Or, how about this other example Kropotkin gives? The owners of capital produce commodities for leisure when people still lack necessities. Now, in this case, it's actually interesting. It's not a restraining of production. It is an excess of production, but in certain areas. In areas of what we might call non-necessary commodities. So all kinds of things like a selfie stick or a coffee mug that has a thing on the bottom that stirs and warms your cup for you, right? These random things that are not necessary, but all this capital and time is being spent on these, however many things you can find on Amazon, Wish, ads on TV, whatever else, right? All these things that are just, they're interesting for sure, right? But the question is, should we be spending so much time and resources on all those random items that people with disposable income can afford when we still haven't even provided basic necessities for all? As Kropotkin says, we must take into account all the labor that goes to sheer waste. Here, in keeping up the stables, the kennels, and the retinue of the rich. There, in pandering to the caprices of society and the depraved tastes of the fashionable mob. There again, in forcing the consumer to buy what he does not need, or foisting an inferior article upon him by means of puffery, and in producing, on the other hand, wares which are absolutely injurious, but profitable to the manufacturer. What is squandered in this manner would be enough to double the production of useful things, or so to plenish our mills and factories with machinery that they would soon flood the shops with all that is now lacking to 2/3 of the nation. Right, and again, I'm just reminded of, I can't remember where, if it's like the Chilean desert, Peruvian desert, that place in the western part of South America. Perhaps it's multiple places in, the different deserts out there. But you can find pictures of these kind of just vast, basically seas of clothes where, the fashion industry has created, I forget what it's called, but this kind of consumer culture where every season you have to buy like the latest trend in items. And of course, these companies overproduce clothes because they want to produce a lot up front so people can buy it. Not everyone buys all the clothes. What happens to all those clothes? Well, the rest of them then for the new season, they're just thrown away. Where are they thrown? Well, in the desert, of course. So you have these, basically seas of clothes that just line the desert because, well, hey, it's out of season, right? So what is the argument for well-being for all? Well, Kropotkin implicitly gives two different kinds of arguments. I've distinguished them as the moral argument and the technological argument. So the moral argument, he says, is that all things for all men, since all men have need of them. Since all men have worked in the measure of their strength to produce them, and since it is not possible to evaluate everyone's part in the production of the world's wealth. So it's not really possible, nor perhaps is it desirable to decide, well, how much should someone participate in the production of all the commodities that everyone needs, and therefore you get as much wealth as how much you produced. Instead, he says, look, we all have a share in the production of the goods. That we all, actually, society is not possible, right? Even if you go to work and you work in the factory to produce shoes, okay? Well, how did you get to work? Well, probably on roads. Well, someone had to build those roads. So, in a way, you're indebted to the people that build and maintain the roads. You're indebted to, people that make the cars and maintain the cars. You're indebted to the people that grow the crops and sell you the food that you eat and so on to be able to live, to get to work, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a whole network of kind of these background conditions that are made possible by laborers that we don't realize, I mean, again, I sit here and I see this water bottle as this kind of abstract commodity that it just presents itself to me as this finished product, and I kind of take it for granted that I have this bottle, and if it, something happens, I lose it, I can just go buy another one. But people had to make this. The brains to put the things together, and the actual laborial know-how had to exist by actual human beings to produce this thing and bring it to market such that I can buy it. Right? So for me to do all the things like this lecture video right now and be able to drink water to stay hydrated while I do this, this is dependent in part on all kinds of other laborers. And since it takes everyone to do all these different things, then all these different things should be for the benefit of everyone. So that's the moral argument, that no one should be privileged. The technological argument is basically, well, we actually have the technology, right? Capitalism has made it possible to produce all these things. So now what we can do is then change how we organize ourselves around the technology, right? So Kropotkin says it is possible, realizable, owing to all that our ancestors have done to increase our powers of production. We know, indeed, that the producers even now produce such quantities of goods that a certain degree of comfort could be brought to every hearth. We know further that if all those who squander today the fruits of others' toil were forced to employ their leisure in useful work, our wealth would increase in proportion to the number of producers and more. Finally, we know that the productive powers of the human race increase at a much more rapid ratio than its powers of reproduction. That because of technology, our ability to produce does not increase to the rate of people that work. Technology allows us the rate of the increase in production to basically disregard the amount of people that work, right? All the time, automation and everything else, right? Why isn't automation being used for the well-being of all, such that instead of machines making it such that people lose their livelihood because they get fired from their job because now machines can do that job they used to do, it could mean, hey, look, we all can keep our job, but we can work, I don't know, like 15 hours less a week. So now we only work 25 hours a week because machines can do all the rest of that work, right? If a society was organized around the well-being of all, then technology would be used for the well-being of all, as opposed to just for the benefit of, right, mostly the benefit of a minority of people. Now, what does, though, the right to well-being mean, right? And this is where we're going to start to take a look at, well, what really is communism then, right? This alternative that Kropotkin is arguing for. Kropotkin says, the possibility of living like human beings and of bringing up children to be members of a society better than ours, whilst the right to work only means the right to be always a wage slave, a drudge, ruled over and exploited by the middle class of the future. Communism, we could refer to it as socialism as well, but really we're just going to refer to it as communism here, is the democratic and communal ownership of the means of production. Kropotkin says, we must recognize and loudly proclaim that everyone, whatever his grade in the old society, whether strong or weak, capable or incapable, has before everything the right to live, and that society is bound to share among all, without exception, the means of existence it has at its disposal. That what communism then involves, in order to provide the well-being of all, is that everyone who works, everyone who labors on the means of production, they all have a say in what is produced, how much they get paid, how much the product is sold for, and whatever else. Right? You move democracy from being exclusively in the political sphere to the economic sphere. Now, this would involve expropriation, right? Because it would involve saying, okay, private property, which is the means of production or capital. And this is often distinguished from like personal property. So like this bottle could be personal property because it's not used to create profit, but something like a factory is used to create profit or to increase its own value through labor. That things like factories and so on would be expropriated, right, from the capitalist to all the workers, right, where they would share in the ownership and control of that factory, where they would determine, okay, who's going to be the boss on the shop floor? Let's all vote. We don't like how that boss is running operations. Let's vote whether we want to replace that with another worker, how much we want to get paid, right? Everyone would vote on that. Well, how do you do that? Is it through legislation? Is it through revolution? It could be perhaps through legislation, right? We could have democratic accountability for politicians to say, hey, we're going to pass a bill that says that the government will pay for the workers to outright buy the company from the capitalists. But here's a question. Well, capitalists kind of run the political sphere. They run the government. They fund the politicians. So are politicians going to go against what their donors, the capitalists, want? That's kind of a problem. Well, how about revolution then, right? Workers just outright seize the means of production. So this is historically what, Marx and Kropotkin argued is necessary because the government, they said, is already captured by the capitalist class. So, for example, Marx argued this kind of three-step movement here. That first, the proletariat, so the working class, those who don't own the means of production, that they must become the ruling class in order to win what he calls the battle of democracy, in order to ensure that if the proletariat, if the working class takes over the government, they can use the power of the state to then expropriate private property and distribute it equally. Now, once this is done, right, then what happens is now no longer have what Marx referred to as kind of like a bourgeois democracy, but you can start establishing a true democracy where money is not an influence in political affairs. And what this must means is then you need the kind of communist intellectuals to act as a vanguard to kind of steer the revolution in the right way. Now, we're going to see that Kropotkin is going to argue against this. He's skeptical of the use of the state in order to transform kind of economic, social life from capitalism to communism, in order to establish well-being for all. You can kind of think of this as historically three different ways, right? So we have the more reformist way that says, well, we need to work within the system. Historically, there's been some problems, like I just mentioned, the fact that the government kind of is captured by the capitalist class. You have a revolution through the use of the state, because they say, well, look, because the state works for the capitalist class, you need to seize the power of the state so the capitalist class can't use the state against the working class. But then we're going to see that you'll have Kropotkin, right, who's going to say, well, actually, to use the state means that those people, the vanguard, for example, they're going to become corrupted by state power because that kind of has its own injustice, the state does, as opposed to, merely just being an injustice of the capitalist class. So that means that instead, you deny both the authority of the state and of private property. So, what does communism or anarchist communism consist in? Well, if there is no private property, which is the source of exploitation and inequality, then if there is no need for the state, since the state has always existed to protect private property at the expense of the propertyless, right, then we don't need the state. So in communism, the state would kind of wither away because now, if the state previously existed to ultimately benefit the capitalist class, well, now once we've redistributed property such that now capital works for the well-being of all, you don't need the state to kind of always work to defend the capitalist class. And this is something that, of course, the state socialists or the Marxists agree with the anarchists here, that the state would be unnecessary under communism. But the reason why Kropotkin argues for not just the state being unnecessary or even detrimental under communism, but the means to communism can't involve the state, because he says, look, in the economic sphere we have private governments. In the political sphere we have public governments. But in each case, right, they deny what is the tendency of humanity, which is the freedom of association. Now, a society based on free agreement, right, the ability for one to freely say, well, I don't like other governments operating in like Tennessee, so I'm going to go to Canada or whatever else, right? Now, that's the freedom of association, that by virtue of being a human being, you can choose to enter and leave any association you like, whether economically, right, you don't like this job, you go to a different one. In the same way, I don't like how this government's being run, so I'm going to, live under a different government. That a society based on then free agreement, which exists for the well-being of all, is anarchist communism for Kropotkin. And as he says, a society founded on serfdom is in keeping with absolute monarchy. A society based on the wage system and the exploitation of the masses by the capitalists finds its political expression in parliamentarianism. But a free society, regaining possession of the common inheritance, must seek, in free groups and free federations of groups, a new organization, in harmony with the basic economic phase of history. Every economic phase has a political phase corresponding to it, and it would be impossible to touch private property unless a new model of political life be found at the same time. Now, what this communism then consists in is, one, of course, being against the wage system, because it's a product of private property. So the solution isn't in communism to have everyone make the same wage, but to do away with wages entirely. That if someone needs something, they get it. And the idea is that, well, individualism leads to communism for Kropotkin. So you have the ideals of the Enlightenment, right, that revolve around liberty, in these three senses of liberty, whether negative, republican, or positive. So negative liberty says freedom from, right, freedom from coercion. Someone can't just come and tell me what to do, and I have to do it. Republican liberty, which is the freedom to will to do something, right, to form my own thoughts and desires. And positive liberty, so the ability to, or freedom to pursue something, right? Freedom to have health care, right? Not just freedom from people stopping me from being able to get health care, but actually freedom to get health care, to have it, to be taken care of when I need it. Now, this is combined in communism or socialism with political and economic democracy. So we have the democracy in the political sphere, where we're supposed to elect, together those who are going to oversee our political affairs. But also communism and socialism says, look, we also need democracy in the economic sphere. And Kropotkin actually gives an intuitive argument for this idea that these kind of sense of individual rights, right, and individual freedoms in this way lead to communism, that the individual and society kind of go hand in hand here. So the intuitive argument that he gives here says, at St. Petersburg, if you are elaborating an invention, you go into a special laboratory where you are given a place, a carpenter's bench, a turning lathe, all the necessary tools and scientific instruments, provided only you know how to use them, and you are allowed to work there as long as you please. There are the tools, interest others in your idea, join with fellow workers skilled in various crafts, or work alone if you prefer it. Invent a flying machine, or invent nothing. That is your own affair. You are pursuing an idea, and that is enough to have access to all that equipment in this laboratory. We might think that the same way, right? If I'm going to do research or I go into a library, right? It's up to me what I want to do when reading the books. It's up to me how I want to pursue this task, this idea that I might have. In the same way, he says, those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials from the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risk their lives in the raging waves, and sometimes perish, all to save men whom they do not even know. And what need to know them? They are human beings, and they need our aid. That is enough. That establishes their right to the rescue. Thus, we find a tendency, eminently communistic, springing up on all sides and in various guises, in the very heart of theoretically individualist societies. That even in capitalism, he's saying, there is this tendency to actually help the other human being just because they're a human being. Now, what if our society was actually based on that? Based on communal well-being? Kropotkin again says, the bridges for the use of which a toll was levied in the old days have become public property and are free to all. So are the roads, except in the East, where a toll is still exacted from the traveler for every mile of his journey. And similarly, actually, often in the Northeast of the United States. Museums, free libraries, free schools, free meals for children, parks and gardens open to all, streets paved and lighted, free to all, water supplied to every house without measure or stint. All such arrangements are founded on the principle, take what you need. And why? Well, because people need it. And because what else is the point of all these things to exist if not for the well-being of all by fact of being a human being? Now, perhaps then there are objections, likely there are, right? That, well, this society isn't feasible, right? But Kropotkin responds to two objections he says people often make. So the first objection about communism is that there would be forced work. That if the existence of each is guaranteed, and if the necessity of earning wages does not compel men to work, then nobody will work. Every man will lay the burden of his work on another if he is not forced to do it himself. So basically, right? Well, if the motto is take what you need, well then all the things that are needed would have to be provided by someone, which means people must have to work to ensure that everything that people need is provided. This would turn into, of course, people being forced to work to ensure demand is met. Now, there are three responses to this that he gives. First, capitalism already forces people to work through, again, what we looked at, the social coercion of the threat of starvation. Second response, people are most motivated to work when they work in freedom, i.e., when the fruits of one's labor are not robbed, when one owns the instruments of labor, and when one has no overseer. And this is actually empirically verified, that under worker cooperatives, workers are actually happier because they have a say in what they want to produce. They have a say in the company and its direction. They have a say in how much they get paid, right? They, in effect, own part of the company, which means they're not alienated from their labor in any way. So they're more motivated then to work because they can see the reflection of themselves in what they produce, and they can take pride in it. The final response to this objection is that you need to eliminate the class of brain workers as opposed to manual laborers. That while there's the class distinction of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the capitalist and working class in capitalism, there is also in capitalism the class of brain workers, or we often call them like white-collar workers, as opposed to manual laborers or blue-collar workers. Kropotkin says, it is precisely to put an end to this separation between manual and brain work that we want to abolish wagedom, that we want the social revolution. Then work will no longer appear a curse of fate. It will become what it should be, the free exercise of all the faculties of man. That one shouldn't be seen as having a different social status because they, right, are working in some industry that is not involving the brain, but instead everyone should have to take a certain has a certain duty to perform some manual labor, as well as freely, of course, as well, their own, mental labor. So, there's something I think that's admirable in some churches where they require the kind of like taking turns of who has to clean the church. So one weekend, right, it might be one group of kids that have to go and clean the church, and then the next weekend another group of kids that have to go and clean the church. And why do those groups of kids have to go and clean the church? Because they all benefit from the church being clean, right? So they take turns performing that work, as opposed to saying, well, we're going to have one person who's going to be a janitor, right? And that becomes their identity as a janitor. And then that person's kind of looked down upon as a janitor because it's, not seen as sexy or as noble as a line of work, as something else, right? And in this way, you bring back the dignity to the worker that the worker should have. They should have dignity. Now, the second objection is the lazy worker objection. And basically this objection says that the danger of communism will come from that minority of loafers who will not work and will not have regular habits in spite of the excellent conditions that would make work pleasant. So there are three responses to this. Now, the first response to this is that this objection implicitly defends penal punishment in capitalist social coercion. As Kropotkin says, it is true that the majority of bourgeois profit by their privileged position to award themselves the least unpleasant tasks, and that they work under hygienic conditions of air, food, etc., which permit them to do their business without too much fatigue. But these are precisely the conditions which we claim for all workers without exception. Very often the idler is but a man to whom it is repugnant to spend all his life making the 18th part of a pin or 100th part of a watch, while he feels he has exuberant energy which he would like to expend elsewhere. So that this kind of objection says, well, of course, you have to in some way punish workers for not working. So this is, again, similar to the forced work objection. But Kropotkin saying, actually, capitalism already does that. Okay, the second response to this. Kropotkin says that vices are socially conditioned, and that this objection is responding to vices that are created by capitalism, which would no longer be encouraged after a social revolution. So this is a little bit similar to kind of what Rousseau argues, that society creates certain vices. But Kropotkin isn't as, I guess, pessimistic as Rousseau here, because Kropotkin thinks you can do away with these vices by changing the social relations among persons. As Kropotkin says, suppress the cause of idleness, and you may take it for granted that few individuals will really hate work, especially voluntary work, and that there will be no need to manufacture a code of laws on their account, right? Make it such that someone has a stake in the job they perform. Make it such that one can freely do whatever work they want to do, and it's unlikely you're going to have widespread vices of laziness among persons in communism. The last response, ultimately then, if this laziness still exists, right, if someone does not perform the labor necessary for the well-being of all, then expulsion from the community would be justified. Right, as the famous saying from Marx, from each according to their needs, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And if someone has an ability, right, to labor, right, not unreasonable amounts, but if they refuse to provide for the welfare of all and yet take advantage of the work of others, then it would be fair by people in that society to expel them. Now, I'll leave it up to you whether you think these are adequate responses to these objections. But I am curious what you think about the critique of capitalism that comes from this, as well as the arguments in general given to the well-being of all. both morally and technologically.